My family forced me and my grandmother to sit on the porch in the rain while they celebrated inside. You're just used to being left out, my aunt mocked. Shivering, I held her hand as a man approached and said, "Whose house is this?" "Not yours anymore." Their laughter choked off midair. I'm Mirella, 42, and for the better part of my life, I've been the family ghost. Present, but not seen. I was raised by my grandmother, Joy Ashcroft. Everyone called her Nana Joy. She was kind, stubborn, and dignified in that quiet southern way that says more in a look than most can say in 10 paragraphs. I loved her fiercely. I still do. My mother ran off when I was 9. No warning. Just a note on the counter and a fridge full of untouched groceries. My father, to be honest, was little more than a name on my birth certificate. Nana Joy picked up the pieces and raised me in the guest house on the back of our family's estate in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, don't let the word estate fool you. The main house was massive, yes, white columns, winding driveway, the whole Southern Gothic fantasy, but the family was far from picturesque. My Uncle Bernard inherited it after Nana's husband passed away. He and his wife, Ophelia, moved in like royalty arriving to take over a neglected kingdom. The problem was, they never saw Nana as royalty. Not anymore. They tolerated her. Invited her to holidays like it was an act of charity. Over the years, they pushed her further and further to the margins until she was nothing more than the old woman in the guest house. And me? I was her shadow. Tolerated because I kept her out of their hair. Then came the engagement party. My cousin Rosamond, Bernard and Ophelia's only daughter, was getting married to some surgeon from Savannah. The entire estate was transformed into caterers, live music, string lights, and valet parking. It was probably the most extravagant event the Ashcroft property had hosted in decades. And we weren't invited. Not even Nana. I asked Ophelia, gently, if we could at least sit inside during the party since rain was in the forecast. She looked at me like I'd asked to host a funeral in the ballroom. "We've made it clear this is Rosamund's day," she said, lips tight. "Let's not make it about other people's needs. That other person was us." I tried to hide my fury, but Nana's health had been declining, and I didn't want to stress her. So I bundled her up in a thick coat, wrapped a wool shawl around her legs, and rolled her wheelchair onto the porch that faced the gardens. We sat there, beneath the overhang, watching our family drink and dance through the rain-dappled French doors. The music was loud, the laughter louder. No one looked our way. The rain started light. I thought maybe it would pass. But it didn't. It thickened. Turned cold. My sweater clung to my skin, and Nana's hand trembled when she reached for mine. Still, we sat there. Because leaving would have meant surrendering completely to the way they wanted to erase us. Ophelia eventually noticed. She stepped out onto the porch with a flute of champagne, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "You really think this is appropriate?" she asked, voice slicing through the rain. "It's her granddaughter's engagement," I replied, barely keeping my voice steady. "Well, she wasn't invited for a reason." Her tone dropped like a weight. "And neither were you." Behind her, Meredith, Ophelia's sister, poked her head out, drunk and amused. "Oh, Mirella, you're just used to being left out." They both laughed. And then they turned and went back inside. That moment. That exact second. I don't think I've ever felt rage like that. Not hot, dramatic rage. But quiet, deep betrayal. The kind that settles in your bones. I held Nana's hand. She was shivering. I was too. She whispered, "Don't cry. They don't get to have your tears." And then headlights cut through the rain. A black SUV pulled into the circular driveway. The engine cut off, and a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out. He looked determined. Not angry. Not confused. Just like he knew exactly why he was there. He walked up the path toward us and stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He looked from me to the glowing interior behind the French doors. "Is this the Ashcroft residence?" he asked. Yes, I said slowly. Not anymore, he replied. That's when the shift happened. Like the air itself changed. He introduced himself as Andrew Haywood, an attorney. He said he'd been working with Nana Joy for months. I blinked. Nana smiled softly. See, what I didn't know that none of us knew was that decades ago, before Bernard ever took over the house, Nana had inherited a majority share of the property after her husband's death. Quietly, she had placed her stake into a trust. A trust that would remain dormant until a certain condition was met. That condition? Proof that the family was actively trying to push her out. Proof that she was no longer welcome in her own home. And guess what her lawyer had in his briefcase? Emails. Recordings. Witness statements. Including an audio clip where Bernard said, "We'll just wait for the old girl to kick it. Then Morella can find a new couch to sleep on." The house, as of that morning, belonged to me. To me. The porch I was sitting on while soaking wet? Mine. The ballroom filled with crystal and laughter? Mine. The smirking aunts and cousins dancing in ignorance? About to get served. I couldn't even stand. I just sat there, holding Nana's hand, while the lawyer and his assistants entered the house to serve the eviction paperwork. That's where I'll pause for now. Because I need advice on what happens next. They were given 72 hours to leave. And I don't know what to feel. Part of me wants to scream in every room, dance like they did, reclaim every inch. But another part of me ashamedly feels guilty. Because they're my family. Or they were. I've been silent for so long that this power feels foreign. And I'm scared I'll mess it up. I'm scared of becoming like them. Would you keep the house? Would you sell it and start new? How do you navigate that guilt when justice finally shows up? Thanks for reading. I'll update soon if people want to know what happened after the notices were served. Once the eviction notices were served, silence swept over the house like a sudden frost. You could hear the music stop, the strings of the quartet cutting off mid-note. For a second, I genuinely thought they'd try to laugh it off again to pretend this was some elaborate prank. But Andrew stood calmly in the foyer, documents in hand, backed by 2 staff members. And reality hit them hard. Bernard was the first to raise his voice. "This is absurd," he barked, storming toward Andrew. "This house is mine. It's always been mine." Andrew didn't flinch. "It was never solely yours, Mr. Ashcroft. Joy Ashcroft retained controlling interest in the property via the Ashcroft Trust. You'll find that in Section 7 of the attached documentation. The property is now legally transferred to her beneficiary, Mirella Ashcroft." Ophelia looked at me like I had conjured this out of thin air. She wasn't used to losing control. She wasn't used to me. "You manipulated her," she hissed at me. I opened my mouth to respond, but Nana beat me to it, her voice soft but firm from her chair. "I may be old, but I'm not stupid. And I never was. You were counting the days until I died. Don't pretend otherwise." Her words were like splinters under their skin. Rosamund, still in her silk gown, clutched her fiancé's arm and looked around, confused and desperate. "What are we supposed to do? You're just kicking us out?" "You can't kick us out." "I'm not kicking you out," I said. "The law is." Truthfully, I didn't know I had that in me. To say it so plainly. But I'd sat in silence so long that the words came easy once they started. The look on Bernard's face I'll never forget. The same face he used to make when I was little and reached for a second biscuit at dinner, like I was always taking something I hadn't earned. They had 72 hours to vacate. I gave them 5 days. Not because I was feeling generous, but because I didn't want to watch them pack. I didn't want to see the house filled with boxes and old resentments. I took Nana back to the guest house, where she rested, and I made her tea while the family we once orbited around scrambled to save face and gather their things. On day 3, Rosamund knocked on the guesthouse door. I almost didn't answer, but I saw her through the blinds alone, no makeup, eyes puffy. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said when I stepped outside. "We treated you both like shadows." It sounded sincere. Or maybe she was just scared. "I love this place," she added, staring up at the trees. "But I guess I never really appreciated it." I didn't say much back. I just nodded. Because what was I supposed to say? That I forgave her? That I didn't? Some things don't come clean with words. Some things stay murky. Later that night, Ophelia tried a different tactic. She left a letter for me in the mailbox, handwritten, even. It wasn't an apology. It was an offer. If I let them stay in the west wing of the house, she'd ensure the family would move forward with grace and not drag things through the court of public opinion. I didn't respond. The next morning, movers arrived, and by the afternoon, they were gone. The house was quiet. For the first time in decades, it was just me and Nana and the creaking of hardwood that hadn't seen peace in years. I walked the halls like I was meeting them for the first time. Rooms that had once been off limits were now mine to decide on. The parlor with its cracked fireplace. The library still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe smoke. My grandfather's study. Even the third-floor attic, filled with boxes of memories that no one else ever seemed to value. I opened one of them. Inside were old black and white photos. My mother as a girl. Nana on her wedding day. Letters from a soldier, my grandfather, to his young wife during the war. I sat on the floor for hours, just sifting through them, grounding myself. This house wasn't just a building. It was a collection of stories. Some ugly. Some are beautiful. But mine now, all the same. I didn't throw a victory party. I didn't call the papers. I just got to work. I started small. Cleaned the baseboards. Repaired the leaky sink in the kitchen. Took down the portrait of Bernard over the fireplace and replaced it with one of Nana and me from when I was 12, us planting flowers out back, both of us with dirty hands and grinning like fools. I fixed up the guest bedrooms and made one into a craft room for Nana. She was too frail to sew much now, but she liked to sit in there, touch the fabric, and remember the days when her fingers were steadier. A week later, I got a letter from Bernard's lawyer. They were contesting the trust, claiming emotional manipulation and diminished capacity. I handed it over to Andrew. He laughed and said, "Let them try." Still, it stirred something in me. That guilt again. That creeping doubt. Had I done the right thing? Had I become them? I asked Nana one morning while we sat on the veranda. "Do you think I went too far?" She looked at me over her tea and said, "Mirella, sometimes justice sounds like revenge to people who got used to getting away with everything." I didn't have a response. I just sat there beside her, letting the words settle. Because deep down, I knew she was right. The letter from Bernard's lawyer didn't bother Andrew. "They don't have a case," he assured me. "We were meticulous with documentation. Your grandmother was mentally sound, her signature was witnessed and recorded, and they have no legal claim to a property she never fully relinquished." But even with that reassurance, I found myself checking the mailbox twice a day. I wasn't afraid of losing the house, not really. I was afraid of psychological warfare. The quiet kind. The way they'd look at me if we passed in public. The way Rosamund's Instagram would try to rewrite the story, paint her family as victims of some calculated betrayal. I deleted all my social media. I kept my phone on silent for a week. And I spent every day tending to the parts of the house that had been left to decay, not the walls or the ceilings, but the essence of it. I stripped the living room of the sterile showroom furniture Ophelia had installed and brought in warm lamps, cozy throws, real books. I took down a wall of meaningless art prints and framed family photos instead of ones I found in the attic that hadn't seen light in decades. There was one of my mother's, probably around my age, standing beside a young Nana Joy. They were both barefoot, laughing, holding hands on the back steps. I cried when I found it. That was the version of my mother I had tried to remember, the one who loved me, before life swallowed her whole. I still don't know where she is. Whether she's even alive. And strangely, I didn't feel like hunting her down anymore. If she ever wanted to come back, she knew where to find us. Nana wasn't doing well physically, but her mind was sharp. Every morning, she insisted on getting dressed, brushing her hair, and sitting on the back porch. She said she liked hearing the birds again. They stopped coming when the family did, she mused one morning. Isn't that strange? I didn't tell her they hadn't stopped, they'd just been drowned out by the noise. I think she knew that. The strange thing was how quiet the rest of the town had been about the whole thing. Word spread fast in Charleston, especially in old families like ours, where everybody knows everybody. I half expected reporters or neighbors with thinly veiled curiosity to come knocking. But no one did. Not until the third week, when I found a small envelope tucked into the garden gate. No return address. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten in a tight, masculine script: "You did the right thing. Don't let them make you doubt it." No signature. I turned it over a dozen times, trying to recognize the handwriting. I couldn't. But the fact that someone had written it meant everything. Because the doubt wasn't just coming from outside anymore. It was creeping in from within. When you're cast in the role of lesser for so long, stepping into power feels like wearing someone else's skin. You think every decision will be second-guessed. Every move will be seen as opportunistic, no matter your intentions. And even though I hadn't done anything underhanded, even though I had simply acted within the bounds of the trust, I still felt like I'd committed a sin against something sacred. I didn't expect forgiveness from them. But part of me, maybe the naive part, still wanted acknowledgement. Maybe not a thank you. But at least an admission, we were wrong. Of course, it never came. Instead, a real estate agent showed up at the gates a few days later. She said Bernard and Ophelia were trying to buy a smaller place nearby, something with character and legacy charm, whatever that meant. She asked if I'd be willing to write a letter of reference for them to pass along to a prospective seller who knew the Ashcroft name. I laughed. Out loud. And then politely closed the gate in her face. After that, things were quiet again. But the weight of legacy is a funny thing. When you inherit a place like that, you don't just inherit bricks and furniture, you inherit grudges, myths, expectations. And sometimes, ghosts. That winter, during the coldest storm Charleston had seen in a decade, the pipes froze in the guest house. Nana and I moved into the main house fully for the first time. I set her up in what used to be Rosamund's old room. We painted it a warm ivory, added thick curtains, and filled it with her quilts and plants. On the first night there, after I tucked her in, she called me back before I could leave the room. "You know what I regret the most?" she asked softly. I turned around, unsure what she'd say. "Letting them run things for so long," she whispered. "I should have taken it back years ago. But I was tired. And scared. And I convinced myself I was just being dramatic." She reached for my hand and gave it a small squeeze. "But you? You didn't flinch. You stood up." I sat beside her and rested my head on her shoulder. She smelled like lavender and would smoke. "They'll tell the story differently," I murmured. "They'll say I took what wasn't mine." "Let them," she said. "We know the truth." She fell asleep within minutes, and I sat there watching her breathe, wondering how many times she'd held back over the years. How many times she'd swallowed her hurt just to keep the family peace. And I thought maybe that's what I inherited most of all. Not just the house. But the silence she endured. Maybe now I could be the one to break it. The silence after they left was a strange kind of peace, heavy and light at the same time. I would wake up in the mornings expecting to hear someone else's voice in the hallways, footsteps I didn't recognize, that glassy tone Ophelia used when she talked down to the help. But there was nothing. Just the sound of birds again. The slow groan of the old wood expanding with sunlight. My own breath in a house that had never belonged to me, until now. But ownership didn't mean ease. I didn't realize how much upkeep the place needed. The plumbing in the east wing hadn't been touched in over a decade, and the roof above the breakfast nook leaked during every storm. The garden was still lush, but the soil had gone acidic in parts. The more I looked, the more I saw what had been left to rot beneath the surface of appearances. I started making lists of repairs, improvements, things to donate or restore. The house had good bones, but it had been treated like a museum for too long. I didn't want to live in a shrine to people who had never valued it. I couldn't do it alone. I hired a small team, a local plumber named Harris, who smelled like mint and coffee, a painter named Elodia, whose work boots left neat square impressions in the dirt, and a young college kid named Marcus, who helped clear out the attic over spring break. They didn't know the full story. I told them just enough. This house belonged to my grandmother, I'd say. I'm trying to make it livable again. They nodded and got to work. No questions. Nana loved the activity. She sat in the parlor with her knitting basket, though her hands could no longer do much, and watched the painters roll fresh coats onto faded walls. She'd hum softly while I made tea in the afternoons, still calling it our little kingdom, like she used to when I was a girl and the guest house was the only world I knew. We fell into a rhythm. Mornings, tea and small walks with her in the garden. Afternoons, housework, repair calls, decisions about everything from cabinet hardware to curtain fabrics. Evenings, books, old movies, and quiet dinners at the long dining room table that had once felt too grand for just two people. But even with that gentle routine, ghosts stirred sometimes. One afternoon, I was in the attic organizing boxes when I came across an old-school project of Rosamund's. A diorama of the Ashcroft estate, made from foam and glue, and a dozen tiny paper people labeled with family names. She had placed Bernard, Ophelia, and herself at the center of the ballroom. Nana and I were missing entirely. No little paper figures for us. No names. Even in her childhood, I thought, she'd already learned who counted and who didn't. That night, I mentioned it to Nana. Rosamund never hated you, she said after a long pause. But she learned to ignore you because that's how they taught her to stay loved. I didn't reply. I just let the words hang in the air between us. A few days later, a letter came. This one from Rosamund. It was handwritten on monogram stationery and folded with care. No return address. Just her name and a P.O. box in Mount Pleasant. In it, she told me she was moving to Chicago. Her engagement had been called off amicably, she claimed, though the tone said otherwise. She said she didn't blame me for what had happened with the house, but that she wished I had come to her first. We could have found a solution that didn't feel like war, she wrote. It stung. Not because it was unfair, but because it showed how little she understood. There had never been a war. There had only ever been their rule and the silence of those who weren't allowed to speak. I didn't write back. But I kept the letter. Not out of sentimentality. But because I knew, someday, I might want to remember the moment she realized she wasn't the center of the story anymore. Later that week, Marcus, the college kid helping with the attic, came down holding a dusty leather-bound book. Thought you might want this, he said, handing it to me. It was Nana's journal. Or rather, a collection of her writings over the years, notes, memories, thoughts. The earliest entries were from the 1950s. The latest were only a few months old. I read the whole thing over 2 sleepless nights. There were stories I had never heard about how she met my grandfather at a train station, how she lost a child between my mother and me, how she had thought, more than once, about leaving the family entirely. One line stopped me cold: if no one remembers the truth, it's like it never happened. She had written it 3 times, like she was trying to make it real. I began recording my own entries after that. In a fresh notebook. Not to replace hers, but to continue it. To remind myself that this house was more than a legacy, it was a conversation across time. That same week, the lawyer handling Bernard's challenge finally called. They've withdrawn, he said. No settlement, no apology, just silence. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled, slow and deep, like I'd been holding my breath for months. But the quiet didn't last long. 2 days later, the Charleston Historical Society reached out. Someone anonymous had nominated the house for a preservation grant. I thought it was a mistake. But then I remembered the note on the gate. You did the right thing. Someone was watching. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Exposed? Supported? Both? The woman from the Historical Society came by in person to tour the property. Her name was Lenore, in her 60s, with silver hair clipped up neatly and a sharp eye for detail. She walked every inch of the house with me, asked about restoration plans, and took careful notes. At the end of her visit, she sat with Nana and me in the parlor. She smiled warmly and said, "I've read about this house for years. But this is the first time it's ever felt like a home." I didn't cry then. But later, when I was alone in the kitchen and saw her handwritten thank you note beside the sink, I did. Because it was the first time anyone outside our story had really seen us. The day the Historical Society awarded the preservation grant, the house felt like it exhaled. $45,000 to begin restoration, with additional funding promised if we opened the house periodically for local tours and educational events. Nana clapped her hands and laughed when I told her. Your great-grandfather would have spit his tea. We've gone from outcasts to patrons. The irony wasn't lost on me. But I didn't take the victory and run. I made it public. The Ashcroft House was officially listed on the Society's online archive. Photos. A brief history. And, at my suggestion, a narrative correction, one that highlighted Joy Ashcroft's role in preserving the home and family legacy through turbulent decades, despite being overlooked by the heirs who claimed authority. It was polite. Professional. But pointed. Within a week, local papers picked up the story. The hidden matriarch of Charleston's Ashcroft estate. I never named Bernard or Ophelia directly. I didn't have to. The timeline was clear, and those who knew us didn't need the blanks filled in. Calls started coming in. First from old acquaintances of Nana's church friends, bridge club partners, even a former nurse who'd cared for her sister and thought Nana had vanished into that big house years ago. They sent cards. Flowers. Some even came to visit, sitting with her on the porch she loved so much, drinking sweet tea and marveling at the way the house had changed. Then came the emails. One from a cousin in Savannah I barely remembered meeting at a wedding when I was a teenager. Hey Morella, saw the article. Didn't know half of that. Proud of you. Hope you're well. I didn't reply. But I smiled. Because it was starting. The narrative shift. They had tried to write us out, but I was writing us back in. Then came the gala. The Charleston Preservation Society invited me to speak as part of their spring banquet, an event that Bernard and Ophelia used to attend every year, dressed to the nines, basking in the illusion of community respect. I almost declined. Almost. But Nana urged me. You've earned that room. Don't let their ghosts scare you off. So I went. I wore a simple navy dress. No designer label. No borrowed jewelry. Just a strand of Nana's old pearls and a spine full of steel. I stood in front of a room full of people who had once seen my family name and only associated it with Bernard. And I told the story. Not with spite. Not with bitterness. I told the story of a woman who kept a house alive in silence. Who raised her granddaughter while others looked the other way. Who protected her legacy until she could pass it to someone who would honor it. Who didn't have a seat at the table but built the foundation it stood on. The applause at the end was real. As I stepped down from the podium, I caught sight of Ophelia in the back row. She hadn't been invited, but somehow she was there, stiff as a statue, her lips pressed so tight they barely existed. Her presence should have rattled me, but instead I felt calm. She wasn't a threat anymore. She was a spectator to her own fading relevance. She didn't come up to me. She didn't speak. She just stood there while the crowd passed her by and congratulated me instead. Later, I found a voicemail from Bernard on my phone. A single sentence, raspy and bitter. I hope you enjoy what you stole. I deleted it without listening again. Because I hadn't stolen anything. They had gambled everything on my silence. On Nana's old age. On appearances. And they lost. Months passed. The house transformed. We hosted 2 open garden tours and a community quilting day. I turned the library into a reading space for local kids every Saturday. Nana loved that. She'd watch them run barefoot through the lawn, squealing, chasing bugs and clouds. She passed quietly in her sleep that July, with my hand in hers and the window open to the garden breeze. I buried her beneath the magnolia tree out back, beside my grandfather. The tombstone was simple: Joy Ashcroft, the root beneath the branches. The family didn't attend. I didn't invite them. In her will, she left everything to me officially: every piece of furniture, every acre of land, every antique spoon they had once tried to keep from her. But it was her final letter that stayed with me the most. It was handwritten in the same slow, curling script I remembered from her recipe cards. Mirella, this house doesn't need to be a monument. Let it be a place of living. Laughter. Truth. You gave me back my name. Now live. Loudly. And I did. The ultimate revenge wasn't the eviction. It wasn't the recognition or the applause. It was that I built something they never could, a home rooted in truth. The Ashcroft house stood, not as a symbol of status, but of survival. Of resilience. Of reclamation.